What is up, Nets world? We're back here on the Believe in Nets podcast on the Believe Podcast Network. As always, I'm your host, Erik Slater, Brooklyn Nets beat reporter for ClutchPoints.com. It's been another rough few days for the Nets. Interesting few days. Also an interesting few days for myself. As many of you may have heard, I was in a pretty rough car accident on the way back from the arena after the Nets lost to the New York Knicks on Tuesday. It was actually captured on a Twitter Spaces, which is pretty crazy timing. I was driving home on the FDR, car behind me hit the guardrail on the left side, lost control, came across, just drilled me. Thankfully, though, I'm okay. No injuries. I was back the next day covering the Nets, back last night to recap another loss against the Minnesota Timberwolves. So that's now 2 losses since I last potted about the Nets, and things, not many things are trending in the right direction. The Nets blew a 9-point fourth quarter lead against the Knicks on Tuesday. That marked their 4th blown lead of 9 points or more in their last 7 games. Then they come back last night. They're down by 7 against the Minnesota Timberwolves entering the fourth quarter. They make a nice rally to come all the way back, but Mikal Bridges misses a pair of free throws with 2 seconds remaining. That would have sent it to overtime. So this is now 17 losses in the Nets' last 21 games. They're 25th in offense, 19th in defense during that span. They're not getting consistent production from just about anybody on the roster. And the trade deadline's approaching, and that's what we're going to be talking about on this episode. We're going to have Mike Scotto from HoopsHype, national NBA insider with good ties to the Nets on to talk about the team's trade deadline plans. But just before the interview, touching on what's going on with the Nets right now, as I said, 4-17 over their last 21, not getting consistent production from about anybody on the roster. And that's coming with the trade deadline approaching and a lot of questions and uncertainty surrounding this roster. When you look at the Nets, they have veterans in Dorian Finney-Smith, Royce O'Neal, Spencer Dinwiddie. There's been a lot of trade conversations surrounding all 3 of those guys, Dinwiddie and O'Neal, and pending free agents. Finney-Smith, obviously a guy that's going to be very sought after on the market. Then you also got Nick Claxton, who's going to be an unrestricted free agent this summer. His name has been floated in trade conversations. You even have a guy like Cam Thomas, who is leading the Nets in scoring this season, but his role has remained pretty volatile and inconsistent, and the Nets are going to be entering potential extension talks with him this summer. Who knows how that's going to go? So could all of that uncertainty be impacting the way their Nets are playing? Logically, you would think that it would have at least some impact because a lot of guys, they don't know what their future holds with this team. I think a good example of that is Spencer Dinwiddie. He's probably the best example, a guy who was an engine of the Nets offense after Ben Simmons went down earlier this season, and also last season after he was acquired at the trade deadline. And his play has fallen off a cliff as of late, and that's led to some questions about his buy-in. Over his last 16 games, he's averaging around 10 points and 4 assists. He's attempting only 8 shots per game. Just wrote an article about this, and I looked up some of the numbers. His involvement and engagement with the offense has been glaringly different and down compared to where it was earlier this year. Over those last 16 games, averaging 8 drives per game. Spencer's drive and kick, offense was a big spark to the Nets earlier this season. The Nets were playing their best basketball when he was doing that at a high level. And I said, averaging 8 drives per game over his last 16 appearances. Last season, after he was acquired by the Nets, he was averaging 16 per game. So a very telling number in regards to where his engagement is at. He's had some interesting quotes, and, he's the most glaring example. I'm not questioning other people's buy-in or necessarily even his. I'm just saying that this trade speculation, all this uncertainty could have a trickle-down effect on some of the guys on the roster who were involved in those conversations. And it's something that I asked Jacques Vaughn about last night after the Minnesota loss, and this is what he had to say.
We're 2 weeks away from the trade deadline now, and obviously it's a team with some question marks, some guys who are being mentioned in rumors. Do you get a feeling that that's something that could be weighing on this team, a lot of guys with uncertainty?
Erik, I acknowledged it to the group in all honesty. I just like being transparent, and I told these guys this is the nature of our business. That's what we do. For some guys, it's going to be harder just because either they haven't been traded, they're not used to their names being in rumors. That's the world we live in. There's so many sites that you can go on. You got your phone with you, 24/7. You got a job. You either play for the name on the front or play for the name on the back. So play for the name on the back, make your kids, your mom, your aunt proud of you, that you have pride when you go out on the floor. Play for the name on the front. On the 1st and 15th, you get a check. You have a job. This is an unbelievable career. Play as hard as you can. I acknowledge that to the group. That's the world we live in. It might affect some dudes more than others, though. I agree with that, Erik.
So you heard it there from Jock Vaughn, acknowledging it to the group. This is a group that has a lot of guys that are involved in potential trade conversation. It's a group that's not playing good basketball right now, anywhere near consistently. So obviously it's not, unreasonable to assume that some of those conversations could have some effect on this roster and some of the guys that they had been accustomed getting consistent production from last season and at points earlier in this year when they were playing some good basketball. They were 13-10 through 23 games. So what direction do the Nets go? Are they buyers? Are they sellers? Are they something in between? Are they looking to make a move? Are they looking to gather assets and collect for a lot of these guys on this roster? All that remains to be seen. But Mike Scotto, one of the best guys in the business to talk about that, have a full interview with him after the theme music. I'm joined now by the guy you want to know at the trade deadline, the guy with the intel, the paisan of the podcast, Mike Scotto. How are you, man?
What's up, brother? Happy to see you doing well after you became a viral sensation when we were on Twitter Spaces.
Yeah, rough night the other night, but thankfully I'm okay. I got about 100 text messages after that, but
Nothing
all right.
I got to go, guys.
I got
Guys, I gotta go.
My friends were texting me after that, and it's like there's like this meme of SpongeBob, and it's like I'm a head out, guys, and it's like that was like me in that one. So rough night, but that seemed like a good encapsulation of how the Nets season has gone thus far. We're entering rough times with the Brooklyn Nets. They're 4-17 over their last 21 games, 11th in the East, 25th in offense, 19th in defense during that span, and obviously facing a litany of questions with the trade deadline approaching, obviously in an interesting situation because they don't have their picks. Those are all going to Houston, so they don't have any incentive to bottom out, but they're also not anywhere near contention with this group. So there's an extremely wide range of outcomes for this team at the deadline. You could picture it being anywhere from a fire sale to they make a big move and try to make a splash. So you're in the know, all this stuff. In your eyes, are the Nets buyers or are they sellers or are they something in between ahead of the deadline?
I guess in theory, when you look at the Nets, you can make the case for both. But right now, the best player on the market, I would say, is DeJounte Murray. So I don't really know if I think there's a scenario where they could, if they want to get involved, go for him. But as I reported on HoopsHype, they haven't wanted to give up the 2 first-round picks that Atlanta is looking for. Now, other teams, including the Knicks, are of that mindset as well. But, the Lakers, they're willing to offer 1 in 2029. You got D'Angelo Russell's contract and Jalen Hood-Schifino, who they're essentially marketing as a second first-round pick because he was just drafted in the first round of this draft in this rookie class. But the biggest caveat to that is Atlanta doesn't want to take on D'Angelo Russell, and they're trying to find a third team. I talked with Jovan Buha on the HoopsHype podcast about a couple teams that could make some sense. Maybe Washington, Charlotte's a team that's open to taking on contracts for picks, and other teams with cap space that Jovan mentioned was the Detroit Pistons and the San Antonio Spurs. But for the Nets right now, I'm focusing on 3 guys: Dorian Finney-Smith, Royce O'Neal, and Spencer Dinwiddie. With Dorian Finney-Smith, as I've reported, they wanted the equivalent of 2 first-round picks. Royce 1 ideally, although I think for Royce, most teams would probably like to do multiple second-rounders. We'll see if that moves the needle for Brooklyn. And with Spencer Dinwiddie, he's had a varying role with this team, and in the eyes of executives around the league, before the other night, he's pretty much been absent in fourth quarters for the Nets, and so that's leaving other teams around the league to believe that he can be available ahead of the trade deadline coming up here on February 8th.
Yeah, when you're looking at the Nets potentially looking to gather some draft capital and recoup assets. I've said for a while, and it's no secret, that their trade deadline was going to center on their veterans and or impending free agents, which is obviously, like you said, Spencer, Royce O'Neal, Dorian Finney-Smith, not a free agent, but in that conversation. Nick Claxton has been a guy who's been mentioned on the fringes in that conversation. When you're looking at, those different players, I think Dorian Finney-Smith is the one that is most realistically looking at potentially being moved and may garner the most value. You're saying the Nets are looking for 2 first-round picks, or the equivalent of 2 first-round picks in return for him. With what you're hearing, what's the appetite, the market around the league, and is that a price that realistically they could look to actually get in return for him?
Well, I think there's caveats to both sides. So if you're rival teams, in theory, can you get to 2 first-round picks? In theory, but you probably have to heavily protect them if you were going to do that, where they don't necessarily convey. I don't know if Brooklyn would want to do that, but essentially the equivalent of 2 first-round picks means, in theory, 1 first-round pick and then, maybe a young player or a rotation-style player in return. So there's different ways they can do it. I would say when you look at the Nets and the trade candidates they have, Dorian Finney-Smith, outside of a Mikal Bridges, who they're not making for sale at this point, I would argue that Dorian Finney-Smith has the most interest from teams around the league on the Brooklyn Nets roster right now.
Yeah, when you're looking at the guys that they have available, Dorian is a guy who his skill set obviously is one that a lot of contenders are going to be looking for, that will mesh easily with a lot of teams. He can shoot the 3 at a high level, struggling a little bit as of late, but even with, some glaring recent struggles, still around 38% on the highest volume of his career. Through those shooting struggles, he's kept his defense at a very high level, held Paul George and Kawhi Leonard to extremely modest shooting numbers in that game Sunday, the loss to the Clippers in Los Angeles. And he's a guy that, when teams are looking for, people that they're going to trade, they're looking for matching salaries on a very team-friendly contract. He's making around 13 or 14 million this year, around the same next season before a player option in 2025, 26. Are there any teams in particular that you've heard linked to him or you think would make sense that may try to make a strong push for him with the playoffs coming up?
I mean, there's a bunch of teams, but I would say some that have gotten out there, the Los Angeles Lakers. I touched on it on the podcast with Jovan Buha on HoopsHype. I don't know if they have enough, but we'll see if they maybe try to do something bigger. Just essentially what I would say in a roundabout way are teams that are playoff teams / contenders are looking at him as a piece that can really fortify a bench and be a guy that can help add depth ultimately to a team that's trying to contend for a championship, or a team that's looking to make some noise in the playoffs and go further than they did last season.
And continuing on the theme of the Nets potentially being sellers with some of those other guys, obviously Royce O'Neal and Spencer Dinwiddie are the other veterans. Mm-hmm. O'Neal is a guy who it's been reported that they were looking for a first-round pick in return for him dating back to last season. He's been a fixture in trade conversations really since the Nets acquired him in the 2022 offseason. And then Spencer Dinwiddie, as you said, a guy who was playing some pretty high-level basketball earlier in the year after Ben Simmons got injured. And as of late, the production has really fallen off a cliff, and that's led to questions about his buy-in, things along that line. Over the last 16 games, averaging around 10 points and 4 assists, shooting 38%. He's averaging 8 drives per game during that span. Last season, after he was acquired, he was averaging around 16 drives per game. So really a good image of his involvement and his engagement in Brooklyn's offense. And you and me have heard responses that Spencer's given in the past about the Nets core, who he expects to be with the team moving forward. He has notably omitted himself from that conversation at several points. The latest example was after the Knicks loss, when he said that, the team has guys that they're going to be building around, and that his clutch play and his other stuff is in the past, and it's not, what's happening right now. So when you look at Spencer and Royce, what do you see the market as being for them? Do you see them as guys who could realistically go out there and garner the Nets anything, significant asset-wise?
Well, I'll start with Spencer. I think with Spencer Dinwiddie, when you look at other point guards that are available on the market, there's certainly other tiers. You've got DeJounte Murray is probably the top guy in my opinion. Then you have, I would say, Tyus Jones as a guy that Washington is looking for a first-round pick for, ideally. And so I don't know if they're going to be able to get it, but it's something they're looking for right now. And so then where does Spencer Dinwiddie fall in that equation? I think regardless of how you feel about his recent play, generally around the league, he's viewed as a guy that can be a playoff rotation piece on a team, and that ultimately him having an expiring contract is noteworthy and flexible. So for me, I see if depending, I think it's going to start really the dominoes with him for DeJounte Murray. And you're going to have to go from there first, and then down to Tyus, then to split between Tyus Jones and Spencer Dinwiddie for me when you're looking around the league as far as guys that could really kind of move the needle at this point thus far. And you know, you mentioned also about Royce O'Neal. With Royce, similar to Dorian Finney-Smith, everybody right now is kind of surveying that market to see which kind of wing players are going to become available and truly at what cost. For Dorian being on, for Royce O'Neal being on an expiring contract, it lessens the price for him a little bit. And, you know, again, if a team gave a highly protected first, I really think the Nets would consider it. But again, I don't think teams want to go that far yet. You know, it could be a scenario where he gets multiple second-round picks, and then the Nets have to decide if that's worth it to them or not, or do you keep Royce down the line? And, you know, I've mentioned this before, just food for thought. He's good friends, very good friends with Donovan Mitchell. So if you keep him on the roster past the deadline and you're looking down the road at trying to make a swing at him in the offseason, doesn't hurt.
In Royce's case, Mark Stein reported on his Substack last week that a front office executive had told him that the Cavaliers have Royce on their list of trade targets ahead of this year's deadline. And obviously his relationship with Donovan Mitchell, with the Cavs trying to pitch him on an extension, could be a factor there. So, yeah, with Royce, it really seems like a guy who the Nets maybe could, like you said, be deciding, you know, looking at potentially multiple second-round picks and salary fillers as compared to a first-round pick, and then kind of weighing, is that worth it versus a guy that we want to keep on the roster moving forward if we want to remain competitive. In Dinwiddie's case, you're talking about the point guard market. The Heat and the Hornets just swung a deal for Terry Rozier, obviously got sent to Miami. And he's a guy who's making a similar number to Dinwiddie, not an expiring contract, but similar number, playing at a much, much higher level than Dinwiddie this season. And he went for Kyle Lowry and a 2027 first-round pick. So if the market for Terry Rozier is a salary filler and one first-round pick, and he's been unquestionably playing at a much higher level than Spencer Dinwiddie this season, I think that could give a glimpse into what the market potentially could look like for Spencer Dinwiddie. And in Dinwiddie's case, could be a piece where, more so than the Nets looking for what they get back for him, they could be looking at him as a salary filler that could get them involved in other deals. And I think that this is a good segue into the DeJounte Murray conversation that you brought up earlier, because like you said, the Hawks and the Lakers have been involved in trade conversations involving Murray. Murray's seen as the most high-level player who's going to be potentially on the move at this year's deadline. And the snag in those conversations has been the finding a third team for D'Angelo Russell, because you reported that Atlanta doesn't want to take on any money past this season. They want to clear Murray's money off their books ahead of next season. So I wrote an article a couple of weeks ago, and that kind of presents two paths for the Nets of ways that they can get involved with this. The first being they can look to beat out Los Angeles's offer, which is going to center on their 2029 first-round pick and Russell and potentially other stuff. Or they could look to be that third team who takes on Russell in return for Dinwiddie, allowing the Hawks and Lakers to facilitate the trade. So obviously the difference there would be for Russell, they're probably looking at giving up no draft capital and potentially even getting something in return, versus going for Murray, where they're probably going to have to give up likely multiple first-round picks. Are either of those situations, do you think, palatable for the Nets, and which direction would you see them going in if they were to get involved?
I would say, are they plausible? Yeah, I mean, in theory, they're plausible for the Nets, but they haven't shown a willingness, like as I mentioned earlier, to give up 2 firsts for DeJounte. So I don't think straight, unless they change that stance. I don't know if I see that yet. They have Spencer Dinwiddie's contract that they can use to fulfill that requirement for Atlanta. And it could, in theory, be just a 2-team trade in that sense and make it less complicated than what the Lakers would have to do. As far as getting involved as a third team potentially for taking on D'Angelo Russell in a 3-team deal that would net DeJounte Murray as a Laker and, probably Dinwiddie to the Hawks and then, pick. For the Nets, what are they getting out of it? And who are they getting it from? Because if the Lakers are giving the 2029 pick to the Hawks, are the Nets going to do something for a second-round pick or 2? I don't see how that really moves the needle. So that's, to me, where it gets a little bit complicated. And they would just have to decide ultimately if a couple of things with D'Angelo Russell in that scenario. One, are you comfortable with him opting into his player option next year when you have to pay Nick Claxton in free agency? And 2, if he declines and becomes an unrestricted free agent, what are you willing to pay to keep him? And if he goes off the books, then you're in total search of a point guard going forward, looking ahead to next year. So I don't know if I would say either scenario is ideal. I mean, on paper, certainly DeJounte Murray would make the team better now. But given the I would say, tailspin that the Nets have been on the past 20 games as we're recording this, what incentive or what validity do you see from this group that one player is totally going to shift things going forward? You're currently outside of the play-in, and even if you got a guy and you got into the play-in, where is that getting you ultimately in the grand scheme of things? I think for the Nets, this is a needle-moving point where you really got to decide going forward without the Houston picks, how are you going to try to build around Mikal Bridges if you're them? And I think a bigger question that they don't seem to be willing to say yes to right now would be, do you move Mikal Bridges and just go all in on a full rebuild and get as many draft picks and really start this thing over? But they believe right now that Mikal Bridges is a part of the solution. So, again, I don't think either scenario is ideal. What could maybe move the needle for DeJounte Murray is if they move Dorian Finney-Smith, and let's say you get back a pick and a player, or if you get 2 and they're lottery protected or something like that, do you then take that extra pick that you had and use it for DeJounte? You could. I don't know if that's going to, whet their appetite, as they would say, to do so. But these are all the palpable, plausible, whatever adjective you want to say, potential scenarios that they're going to have to go through within the next couple of weeks before the trade deadline.
That's the conversation, that last point that you just made, that I feel like is really relevant, because Brian Windhorst was quoted a week or 2 ago talking about the Nets' intentions ahead of the deadline, a guy who's been in the know with the Nets, and said that they're expected to be buyers throughout the NBA. And obviously that, incited a response. And my response to that was that, you can be a buyer, you can be a seller, you can be a buyer while you're a seller. You can look to move things around and do a retool as opposed to a rebuild. And, digging in deeper to this DeJounte Murray conversation, for me, ideally, the intrigue surrounding Murray always centered on him being a guy who is a high-level player who fits a need for the Nets, who could potentially be had at a discounted price. And to me, that was Spencer Dinwiddie and something along the lines of maybe 1 first-round pick. As I think Bobby Marks floated that as a potential price on the podcast with you a couple of weeks ago. But you've done some great reporting as of late that indicates that the Hawks are looking for 2 first-round picks. And, it's getting to a point where, is that a wise move, as you said, for a team that right now is frankly looking like one of the worst teams in the league over these last 21 games? Are they in a position where they can be giving up 2 first-round picks for a guy like DeJounte Murray? And then obviously also all first-round picks aren't created equal. Everybody just likes to throw the term first-round pick out there. There's some first-round picks that are protected. There's some that are coming from teams that are very good. There's some coming that teams from that suck. There's some in the future. There's some closer. The Nets' premium picks are regarded as their 2027, 2029 picks from Phoenix and Dallas, as well as their own picks that far out, all of which are unprotected. The Lakers are potentially offering up their 2029 first-round pick, presumably unprotected, for a guy like DeJounte Murray. So the Nets aren't going to get into those conversations offering, likely offering their lower-level first-round picks. So are they willing to part with, those premium picks in return for a guy like DeJounte Murray, who's a good player, but not a huge needle mover for a team that finds itself outside the play-in right now? It doesn't seem all that likely. Now, like you said, could they move a guy like Dorian Finney-Smith, look to get a pick there, package that with something else, and go for Murray? Not out of the realm of possibilities, but, it's a tough proposition for a team that's struggling the way the Nets are. And just when you're looking at Murray's situation, he's averaging 21 points and 5 assists this season, 47, 39, 84 shooting splits. He's making $18 million, so near an exact match to Spencer Dinwiddie this season in terms of salary. But then he's entering next season. He's beginning a 4-year, $114 million contract. Bobby Marks has reported he's got a $13.4 million trade kicker that's going to add $3.4 million to his salary for the first 3 years of that deal. So you're looking at a guy who I think his cap hit, if the Nets were to trade for him next year, is going to be around $28 million. The Nets are going to be looking to avoid the luxury tax, to stay out of the repeater tax. They have Nick Claxton, who they want to sign to an extension. That's going to complicate a lot of things, taking on a player in Murray who makes that much. So to me, all of those factors involve them, not likely wanting to part with their premium picks, multiple first-round picks in return for a guy like Murray. The financial component of it has pointed to them more logically being involved as a third team, potentially, as the team taking back D'Angelo Russell. And you did a good job laying out the positives and negatives of all that. Russell has a player option for $18.7 million next season. So they'd essentially be swapping Dinwiddie for Russell, maybe getting back like a second-round pick in that scenario. Probably not something all too significant as a sweetener from Los Angeles for them helping facilitate the deal. Now, where does that get you? Not very far, I would say. D'Angelo Russell is, I think, a better player than Spencer Dinwiddie, but is he a needle mover for this team? Not, in anything significant context. But you and me have watched Spencer Dinwiddie play over the last 3 weeks. We've heard his comments. I just touched on those. He's not a guy who sounds like it's all that likely that he's going to be on this team moving forward. And he sounds like a guy who knows that. And in that scenario, although Ben Simmons' grand return is potentially approaching, but we know Simmons' availability in recent seasons is well chronicled on this podcast and numerous others. If Dinwiddie's out the door, somebody's got to be in the door. I've said this. I said this with you on the podcast, I think 2 or 3 months ago when we were talking about this. The Nets need a point guard. It's evident with Spencer Dinwiddie playing at this low of a level right now where their offense is going to be at if they don't have a point guard, which they really haven't for these last 2 or 3, even pushing close to a month now. D'Angelo Russell, great player. No. Decent player, I'd say. He's averaging 17 and 6 this season, 48, 42, 78 shooting splits. Interestingly, he's been on a tear as of late, leading right up to the trade deadline. He's averaging 20.
I don't think he wants to be moved.
Yeah, it doesn't seem like he does.
And I'll say this just on D'Angelo, any team that gets him, the flip side, if he does opt into his player option, is you have that salary slot on an expiring contract to trade over the offseason and up to the trade deadline next season.
Gives you some flexibility.
So that's something to keep in mind. And, Ben Simmons is going to be an expiring $40-something million contract next year, which from a business perspective, forget anything about the player, is movable.
What's, obviously D'Angelo Russell's player option, as I said, $18.7 million next season is, a significant component in this conversation. Do you have any sense of what his market could look like? And is he expected?
It's way too early to suggest what it would be now. We haven't even gotten through the trade deadline. It's hard to say.
Do you think the expectation is that he would pick up that player option, or is it too early to tell?
I think as of today, on one hand, you can make the case, yeah, but on the other hand, look at the way he's played leading up to the trade deadline. The guy's been on fire and boosted his value.
Yeah. Over his last 7 games, at 27.4 points, 6.4 assists, 54% from the field and 53% from 3. So he's on a little bit of a heater right now.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and that, getting in, that just gets into the conversation with the Nets of, even if you were to opt out of that player option, if all you're doing is swapping Dinwiddie for Russell and maybe getting back a second-round pick in return, Dinwiddie is an unrestricted free agent this offseason. It doesn't seem like he has a future with the Nets. So you could argue, what are you losing in that scenario? Are you getting back a guy who's playing at a much higher level? And even if he is to opt out and be an unrestricted free agent, you're getting a rental for half of this year of a guy who's playing at a higher level than Dinwiddie is, and it's an interesting conversation with Dinwiddie. You reported a little bit about, the Nets having preliminary extension talks with him early this season. Just what did you hear went down in those talks, and how did that factor into where his situation is now?
Yeah, just very brief potential short-term stuff. Wasn't going to move the needle for Spencer Dinwiddie. And so then when he came on the HoopsHype podcast before the regular season started, he touched on the fact that, if this was it for him, then he'd leave the Nets in a better place, after coming here, and he'd still be a fan. He knew that the writing would be on the wall then if they didn't want to commit to anything long-term. And with Ben Simmons at the time, the Nets were trying to give him the keys to the point guard position and make him the focal point of the team. And that lasted a handful of games, maybe slightly more than that. And so now if you're the Nets, even if he comes back, you can't trust that Ben Simmons I'm referring to. You can't. So just given over the past 3 years, his injury history is too much. And so you then have to figure out, okay, like you touched on, who's your point guard going forward? Because if you're not bringing back Spencer, then are you doing a short-term fill? Are you trying to do it through the draft? Are you doing it through a trade for D'Angelo Russell or DeJounte Murray? A lot of chess pieces on the table that still need to be moved.
And they're going to need a point guard just for the second half of this season. I mean, you talk about going forward, obviously they're going to need to find one. But if they trade Dinwiddie, which seems like it's overwhelmingly trending in that direction, that's why I said I think, Murray, them being priced out of Murray, logically, leads me to believe that Russell could be the more likely option, because they just need a guy for the second half of this year to avoid giving, if they, are hoping to avoid giving Houston one of the top 5 or 6 picks in the draft. So, outside of Russell, is there anybody on the point guard market that you could see them sniffing around on?
I don't think Tyus Jones would necessarily be a fit for them because he's on an expiring contract also. So
tough defensive fit also next to, not that D'Angelo Russell's a great defender, but, I guess it's a tough defensive fit either way next to Cam Thomas, but go on.
Wow. The Nets don't exactly have the best record since Cam Thomas has gone to the bench. What is it, Erik?
2-13? 2-13, actually. Yeah, I think it's 2-13.
As of this recording. So, that's as much a hot topic as anything. And forget, what? We talk about all the trade stuff and things like that. How about the guys on the roster? Like, to me, when Cam Thomas went to the bench, he was the team's leading scorer. And now, they've had times where they struggle offensively. And, I just don't. It's been interesting to see his minutes go down and fluctuate. I could understand why, if you're Cam Thomas, you would be a little upset with that, given the way you scored the ball, and he's moved the ball more as a playmaker. I think in terms of averaging more than 4 assists over the past few games and whatnot. So we'll see if it translates to more minutes for him. But I think for the Nets, if they're going to win more games, in a way, I think he needs to have more minutes.
I think that's a fair conversation. It's a fair point by you because, if they want to win more games, he has to have more minutes. You're talking about from a developmental standpoint. What they're doing right now isn't resulting in winning anyway. So you might as well play the guy and, let him play through some struggles. The point that I made when Cam came out of the starting lineup was I thought that he should be starting, just given the fact that Spencer Dinwiddie's 30 and frankly doesn't look too invested in the team moving forward. It does put the Nets in a difficult position because Cam, although he's made some improvements as of late, he's not anywhere near a high-level playmaker. But, you're looking at a guy that I said, even if he's not in the starting lineup, his minutes and his role need to remain consistent. And they haven't. And frankly, that's not exclusive to Cam Thomas. Not many players on this roster have had their role and minutes remain consistent outside of Mikal Bridges and Nick Claxton. If you're talking about a closing, in terms of closing games, that scenario has just been a complete, shuffling over the last 2 weeks. It's been, just a rotation of things. I think that's contributed to some of their late game struggles. And that's at the worst fourth quarter net rating in the league over this 4-17 stretch over the last 21 games. But interesting that you touched on Cam Thomas. 2 guys that I want to touch on before rounding out the episode. One is Cam Thomas. One is Nick Claxton. Obviously, Claxton is entering unrestricted free agency. There's been, a conversation around would the Nets have the appetite to pay him a contract, which is looking like it could be $20 million plus. What do you see from him? It seems like trade speculation surrounding him has cooled off. Do you see him as a guy who's even going to be put on the table, or do you see him as a guy that they're looking to extend and maybe make a decision on him later?
If you're the Nets, you have to listen to everything at this point. What I would say is for Nick Claxton, I've reported this before on HoopsHype, but they've given off the indication that they are going to pay him this offseason. Quite frankly, you can't lose him as an asset for nothing. So you can always pay a guy, and then if you decide to flip him later in a trade, you can do that. But for all intents and purposes, Nick Claxton has played well this year. I find it ironic, but ever since he and I did an interview, and when he said he wanted to stay with Brooklyn, his numbers have gone up pretty significantly. So I thought that was an interesting correlation. And I think ultimately, right now, if you're a team that is considering trading for him, you'd probably, he only signed a 2-year deal. That's part of the issue too. Mm-hmm. So before that, in terms of like bird rights and whatnot, things get a little trickier there. I think for Nick, as of today, like I ultimately see him staying and going past the deadline, and then the Nets are going to have to re-sign him ultimately. You can't lose him for nothing.
And then Cam Thomas is, I think, an under-discussed name ahead of the trade deadline because the Nets picked up his team option for next season, but there's been well-chronicled inconsistencies and sometimes seems like approaching, obviously, discontent with his role. And when you're talking about a guy that is the leading scorer on the team right now, he's approaching an offseason where I'm assuming that his camp is going to want to talk about a potential extension. Mm-hmm. Who knows what those conversations are going to look like with the Nets, because it's been an interesting ride with Cam Thomas. Is he a guy that, what could you see coming from those extension talks? I know it's tough to say right now. And do you think that he's a guy who they're going to listen on everyone, but is he a realistic, trade candidate ahead of the deadline?
I mean,
it's hard to even say what the appetite would be around the league because he's such a polarizing player, but there's definitely some.
That's the word. I was searching for it in my mind, but yes, I would say for Cam Thomas, could he be a piece that maybe gets included in a trade if it needs to get pushed over the threshold, sure. Standalone value, I think, is tricky at this point. Just like I think figuring out what his extension number would be tricky.
One of the trickiest things in the league right now for a guy who has his ceiling, but also has had his inconsistencies with where the Nets view him.
Yeah, I agree. I can't even begin. I've had these conversations with many people, and I can't even begin to come up with a ballpark range. I haven't. I mean this in all sincerity and through like diligence of trying to find the answer to that question. I have no clue. I have no clue. I really, that tells you how wide the spectrum is for him. So we'll see coming up.
And yeah, Scotto's a guy who's in the know. So when he says, I got no clue, a lot of people got no clue. And that likely might include the Nets and
both sides of the equation.
Yeah. So that'll be a really interesting situation to monitor with how the Nets handle him. He had some answers in shoot around yesterday where he didn't sound too enthused. Got asked about the struggles, and we had the ain't shit funny graphics last season. Now we got asked the coach when asked about the struggles. So he was asked if his late game minutes feel performance based or random. He said random. I asked Jock Vaughn, who has said late game minutes are performance based. I asked him last night before the game, how do you feel about Cam saying they're random and why is there a disconnect there? And he gave me a pretty epic word salad that was 400 words long, but
and you tweeted it.
I had to tweet it. I mean, what am I going to – I can't tweet a little and then it gets lost in translation and then people are calling for his head. So I tweet the whole thing.
I would just put the video but the replies of the scrolls were pretty funny, and I'm not reading all that.
People are looking – people are rightfully angry right now. They're looking for things to be mad at. I'm caught in the crossfire often. Don't kill the messenger. I'm trying to deliver info here. But – yeah, so Cam's conversation it's going to be an interesting one, to say the least, at this trade deadline, particularly approaching this offseason. Last thing before I let you get out of here, Scotto, I'm going to put you on the spot here. We've talked about around 5 players, so I'm going to run through those 5 players, and based on, you're a guesstimate, if you will, are they going to be on the Nets roster past the trade deadline? First guy is Dorian Finney-Smith.
No.
Royce O'Neal.
Honestly, 50-50.
Spencer Dinwiddie.
If there's something worthwhile, I think he goes. If not, they wait and look to do something with him similar to what they did when he last left the Nets.
You think they'd actually realistically bring him back after the deadline?
Can always sign and trade him.
You don't think it's past the point of no return?
It depends what the return is. But again, I just think that you can always sign and trade them. So if you feel like that's better than the offers that you have now and you're going to have more flexibility to do what you really want to do, what's the difference at this point, given where they're at?
Nick Claxton, next guy.
He stays.
And Cam Thomas.
Stays.
Okay.
And I say Dorian not on the roster just because I think there's so much interest in him, and somebody's got to make a move for a contender. I think someone's going to make it worth Brooklyn's while to trade for him.
Yeah, that's the feeling that I got, and we're pretty aligned on those answers outside of maybe Dinwiddie. But yeah, Dorian's going to have so much interest. He's a guy who's 30 years old. Even though he's in a little bit of a cold stretch as of late, he's shot the ball at a very high level, and he's playing at one of the highest levels of his career over this large sample of work this season. To not capitalize on that value with where some teams are going to be looking to value him and try to make a push in the playoffs would be a very interesting decision, to say the least, on the Nets' part. Any parting thoughts on the Nets ahead of the deadline before we let you go here?
Any parting thoughts? I'm sure I'll be writing about them a little bit coming up soon, so I'd keep tabs on HoopsHype.com and follow at Mike A. Scotto. They're gonna be active. The Nets are gonna be active.
There we go.
And I would say, well, what does that lead to? We'll find out, but they're definitely going to be in conversation. So if you're a Nets fan over the next couple of weeks, there will be plenty of intrigue coming up before the deadline.
There'll be plenty of intrigue, and Scotto just told you where to hear about all that intrigue, where to follow at Mike A. Scotto on Twitter. Hit his stuff up on HoopsHype, does some of the best work. If you're looking for an insider's perspective, a national insider perspective, Scotto is the guy to be following. So appreciate you for coming on, man. I will obviously see you at Barclays in the coming weeks leading up to the deadline. I'm sure you'll be making the rounds there, doing your thing, but excited to see what you got on the Nets moving forward, man.
Likewise, brother. I'll see you there.
That does it for this episode of Believe in Nets on the Believe Podcast Network, your one-stop shop for everything happening across the sports and entertainment world. Hope you guys enjoyed the interview and the inside scoop with Scotto, friend of the pod, one of the best in the business to do it. If you guys like the pod, please make sure to like and subscribe to Believe in Nets on all streaming platforms, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube. Smash the like button. Leave a 5-star review if you can and you enjoyed it. That really goes a long way. I'm Erik Slater, Brooklyn Nets beat reporter for ClutchPoints.com. You can find all my work on ClutchPoints.com as well as on my Twitter at @ErikSlater_. Constant news, updates, analysis on everything Nets. I'll have more coverage in the coming weeks as the Nets look to break out of this now extended cold stretch and trade speculation intensifying. So I'll have more on all that coming soon.